Let's just dig in. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to do a quick recap of what happened last week. Matthew chapter 24. We'll be reading from verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household, and to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds doing so when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. Last week we spoke about Joseph as an example of that particular slave. That Joseph, the husband of Mary, the earthly father of Jesus, his stepfather, rather, was that particular type of slave to God. That he was so faithful, he stayed awake. And he knew all the prophecies that were pertaining to Jesus Christ. And he did everything that he could to make these prophecies come to pass, because he had faith in what the Lord said, in the word that the Lord had given him. And he was so faithful, in fact, that God made him charge over all of his possessions. Imagine that. God, the Father of heaven and earth, put his Son, who he himself are one. We know the doctrine of the Trinity, that the Father and the Son are one. He put Joseph in charge of this precious child. And Joseph was faithful in that. Now we'll continue, verse 48. But if an evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day that he does not expect him, and at an hour that he does not know, and I will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, and a place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. If over the week you read chapter 25, then you probably went on into because last week I said there was a homework assignment to go ahead and read 25. If not, it's not a big deal. It's the parable about the virgins, about the 10 virgins, half of whom went to sleep. Actually, they all went to sleep, but half of whom had oil in their lamps when they went to sleep, and the other half did not have oil in their lamps when they went to sleep. And when the bridegroom came, they were unprepared for his coming. This is actually the summation of both of my words from last week and this week, is that there are 4 types of servants. There are 4 types of people that serve God. 2 of them that we just read the passages on, I would name them probably pastors or leaders or elders in the church. One of them particularly stays awake no matter what, forces himself to stay awake and prepares his sheep, the sheep that the Lord entrusted to him, for the time of the end. He continues to feed them, continues to give them oil. The other one, he gets drunk. He gets drunk, and I'm not meaning alcohol in the sense of physical alcohol, although that would not be very good either. I mean, he gets drunk with spiritual movements, with other spirits that sound and look like the Holy Spirit. He follows after this move and after that move. And all the while he's beating his brothers and not feeding them, rather starving them. And then the last 2 types of servants are in chapter 25, when we see in the virgins, that they fall asleep. And this is the thing, they all fall asleep. We all have that tendency to fall asleep. But are you the sort of person that prepares oil for when you go to sleep, or do you go to sleep without checking your lamps? And that is the very important point that I'm trying to make here, is either you stay awake and feed your brethren, or if you do have to go to sleep, at least check your lamp is filled with the oil of the Spirit. Because the time of the end is coming. And 2 things are going to happen. Fire, blood, and horrors will happen on the earth. But at the same time, a great drowsiness will come upon the church. And we'll just go to sleep. And I pray that there will be leaders among us that will stay awake and try to feed the sheep that are asleep. Whereas the ones that do go to sleep, I pray that you have oil in your lamps and not be caught unprepared for the time of the end. That was basically my entire sermon in a summation, but we're going to get into more depth here in a moment. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. By the way, in Russia, today is Christmas. They go by the by the Gregorian calendar, and because of that, hello, 1, 2, 3. There he goes. All right. Yep. Gregorian calendar, and the 25th of December. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what was written by the prophet, and the prophet they mean by is Micah. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem. And he said, go and search carefully for the child. And when you found him, report him to me, so that I too may come and worship him. And we're going to move on forward to verse 13. Now when they had gone, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. And remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up, and he took the child and his mother, and while they were still in the night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what was spoken of the Lord through the prophet. The prophet he means is Hosea. Out of Egypt I called my son. I believe Joseph knew these passages, and it was on purpose that he chose Egypt, of all places, to take his child. Because there's Jordan, there's Arabia, there's a lot of places he could have gone to, but of all the places he went to, it was Egypt. Now when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and he sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem, in all of its vicinity, from the 2 years old and under, according to the time in which it was determined from the Magi. Then what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, for she refused to be comforted, because they were no more. The Rachel that is being spoken of here was the wife of Jacob. She's considered the mother of Israel. Even though Jacob had 4 wives, she was his favorite one. Thus all children from all of their wives were considered by the law, her children as well. So, just a moment. We're going to be talking today about, it's actually the title of my sermon, of kings and Pharisees. If you notice that in the book of Matthew, chapter 2, it says that all of Jerusalem was disturbed by it. That all the scribes and the Pharisees heard these words that the King of the Jews was coming, and they weren't rejoicing in the streets. There weren't fireworks going off. They weren't happy about it. This was scary to them. This would shake up the status quo. And they knew it was going to happen in Bethlehem, of all places. And as a matter of fact, I believe many of the scribes and Pharisees were hoping that this new king would be killed, even, because it would shake up the peace that they had gained. We're going to talk a little bit about what is Rome, Jerusalem was in Rome. It was a province of Rome at the time. And who was Herod? Let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. We've got a lot of passages here. Daniel chapter 2. And we'll be reading from 31, verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a great statue, a statue that was large and of extraordinary splendor. And standing in front of you was the appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, and the breast was, and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly iron and partly clay. You continued to look until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue, and its feet of the iron and the clay were crushed by them. Then the iron and the clay, the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that there was not a trace of them found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And let's move straight on into Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. And we'll be reading from verse 7. Daniel 7:7. And after this I was looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. It had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the other beasts that were before it, for it had 10 horns. And while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little horn, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by their roots before it. And behold, the horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Now, if you've never read these passages before, I'm going to give a little bit of an explanation to what they are. These passages are referring to visions that both Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel had about actually the entire history of our planet. When he was talking about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had seen, and if you don't know who Nebuchadnezzar is, I implore you, read the book of Daniel. And if you don't know who Daniel is, please, once again, read the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar was probably, of the kings of this world, he was the greatest king that maybe ever actually lived. The Bible describes his kingdom as the golden head to the statue of the kingdoms of the earth. It was the standard that all the other kingdoms would try to gain. The splendor of Babylon. It was the gold. After him came the Medes and the Persians, and they were just a little bit less than him. They were described as being silver. And after them came the Greeks. The Greeks were described as bronze. And then finally came the Romans. And the Romans were iron. Iron being strong, being fierce in military power. But at the very feet themselves, the iron was mixed with clay, showing it had a shaky foundation. Because Rome would become a new form of a Rome, which would mix the strength and power of military might, and the everyday, ordinary person would be empowered as well. And thus the entire statue was standing on a foundation that was incredibly shaky until a great rock came and destroyed it altogether. That rock is Jesus Christ. It is Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that comes from above. And it will smash the idol and fill the entire earth with a new kingdom. Then later, Daniel had visions of 4 beasts. And the beasts were described as one being a lion with wings and the heart of a man. Another being described as a bear. And then the third being described as a 4-headed, I believe, leopard. And then after that comes this beast that he couldn't even describe. The first was Babylon, the second was Persia, the third was Greece. But the beast he couldn't describe as having iron teeth and many horns was Rome. And what it's describing as Rome doing is that it tramples the earth and tramples the kingdoms of the earth, and even tramples itself and breaks it up into pieces. Now, why does that pertain to us today? Why does that even matter to us? I mean, you'd think that Rome is already destroyed, it's already in the past. The fact of the matter is that is not the case. Rome just shifted. It changed. Many, many, many years ago, Rome fell under Babylonians. And after it fell, it revitalized itself as the Holy Roman Empire under a king by the name of Charlemagne. We're going into a very quick history lesson on this. He made something of a European Union that united all of Europe under one king. After him came other kingdoms, not that different from him. Among them was the British Empire. And after that, it crushed also and broke into pieces. And to this day, the British Empire is scattered all across the globe. And out of their pieces came another kingdom, the kingdom we live in today, even though it's not exactly a kingdom, the United States of America. But they all have a connection to Rome. Don't get me wrong, I'm full American. I'm a patriot. I say the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm proud to be an American. But one thing that we have to keep in mind, America is not Jerusalem. America is not the kingdom that is to come. It is a kingdom of today. And regardless of how great our own leaders and kings were, such as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, they pale in comparison to the King of Kings. And yet, sadly, we build idols to them. These were humble men, good, humble men. But we've built idols to them and set them up. What does America have in common with Rome that remains today? First of all, we're both superpowers. I mean, but that's pretty general. We were both known for our military strength. We both have what is known as the rule of law, Roman law. Even though we built our laws based on the Ten Commandments, they nonetheless have moved on into Roman law. Ancient Rome had a stable currency that the people could rely on. In other words, all the planet used Roman currency. And the status of being a Roman citizen was respected all across the globe. To this day, one of the biggest things that my dad and myself, we enjoy of having is our American citizenship. It permits us to go into all of Europe. Only place in Europe that we're not allowed to go to without a visa would probably be Russia. But because we've lived in Russia for so long, we have documents that permit us to go in there as well. If you notice in the New Testament, St. Paul, he was very happy that he was a Roman citizen. He constantly spoke about it. It let him get out of tough situations. He just had to say, I'm an American citizen, basically. You can't do this to me. You can't just stone me to death. I have my rights. You know? So there was a status of being a Roman, just as there's a status of being an American. Also, our architecture and our Capitol buildings are very similar. If you take a look at Capitol Hill in comparison to the Vatican, they're almost one in the same building. The dome shape with the pillars, and then across from it, a little ways off, is a giant monument and a giant obelisk in both Rome and in Washington. One is for Washington. The other one was for Roman Caesar, which I forget already. And then, to top it all off, in our Capitol building, at the top of the ceiling, there's a painting, a mural, a giant mural all across the ceiling with Washington. It's called, the Apotheosis of Washington. The painter was Constantino Bermudi, who was a Vatican painter under Pope Gregory the 15th. Washington takes the place of Jupiter, the god Jupiter, or Zeus in his Greek term. All around him are Roman gods. And each of them are teaching people like Benjamin Franklin and James Madison, and they each have their own little special thing that are connected to it. It's actually kind of an odd painting to look at because you see them in their colonial clothing next to the naked gods of the Greeks. It looks a little bit weird, actually. Kind of not really American. And then after the death of Abraham Lincoln, they were planning on making a monument in his honor, but he was such a humble man that many had suggested we need to make a log cabin monument, something simple. But they ended up making basically the Parthenon and making a enthroned giant statue of Abraham Lincoln, very much like the Zeus of old. Once again, I'm not attacking the fact that we have the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial. That's up to you to make of it what it is. But I am suggesting that it is very, very Roman. It is very unlike our Puritan forefathers. And then, to continue on, Rome started devaluing their currency. First, their currency was the currency of the world, and then they started to mix the silver and make their coins less valuable than they actually were. At first, they were like 98% silver. By the end of the Roman Empire, there were like 2% silver on their coins. And still, it was the currency of the world. Afterwards, Rome had set up a welfare state. Free wheat for the masses. Very not unlike what we have coming in the United States. Later in the Roman Empire, there were public schools that were started. Taxation started as something small, but then that moved on to being taxing births, taxing deaths, taxing incomes, taxing this and that. Rome started off as a republic, and then it turned into an empire, meaning that only special elite people could ever rule Rome. Now, it seems like we don't have that in America yet. It seems like such. But one thing I will say, and it is actually fact, that 42 of all 44 presidents are definitely related. And their forefather was actually King John of England. You know, the mean Prince John in Robin Hood's fairy tale? That King John. The one that was known for taxing, for the Magna Carta. The bad guy. The forefather of 42 of our presidents. And the two that are not related to him, as far as we know, was Martin Van Buren, who came from a Dutch royalty, and possibly Donald Trump, who comes from German royalty. So only royals ruled the land. John Montero over here I'm sorry, he'd never become the president. Probably I'd never become the president. Even though there's a tiny sliver of royal blood in me, as far as we can tell. But even that, we don't even know it for sure. And then if you think about it, oddly enough, even the first African-American president was not even an African-American in the sense that we understand an African-American. He did not come from slaves. He was born of Kenyan royalty. And on his white side was white royalty. He wasn't a man of the people, even though he played that role. A true man of the people would have been somebody born of the tragedy that we actually are in fault of. The tragedy of slavery. That would have actually been a pretty great thing if somebody, I believe that if somebody with the right motives and was a good president and personally preferably conservative, although, I mean, everybody has their own preference, but at least it would have been more honest of an outcome than to say that this person who was a royal on both sides of his family becomes president, and then we act as if that is the peak of our equality, when actually he's not the same as everybody else. And then afterwards, they began to have what is known as bread and circuses in order to divulge the masses from their own sorrows and all of their taxations. They gave them sports, Olympics, the Colosseum, great battles full of blood and gore, in which our Christian brothers and forefathers were murdered so that the masses would be happy. Thank God we haven't gotten to the point where we're murdering people for our own entertainment, but we are one tiny step towards doing just that very thing. Already on YouTube, our youth are making light of people committing suicide and murdering and turning it into a show. Even our sports. I'm not bashing football, everybody. But our sports, do you think it's a coincidence that they happen to start to show on Sunday of all days and take the focus of Sunday away? And it started off as a little thing. And then they move into adding more and more occultic practices in our own football stadiums. So that the halftime show, if you're a good Christian, you probably should just turn it off altogether during the halftime. Because it's obviously going to be something that has nothing to do with God. And then they begin to mock even our own patriotism. And they add it to us more and more, and we become stupefied to it. And we're entertained and stupefied, and we don't think about what's actually going on in the world around us. I'm telling you, people, we are living in Rome. This is Rome. Although it had a beginning that was not unlike Israel. And a remnant of Israel still lives today, and I hope this church is among that remnant that holds to the Lord their God and holds to his constitution, which is greater than the constitution made by our American forefathers. And in this Rome, Jesus was born. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, but Judea was a province of Rome at the time. And Rome had erected a president of sorts. He was known as King Herod. And King Herod named himself King of the Jews. The Christians of the day, they were not Christians because Jesus had not yet been born or died on the cross or rose from the dead yet. But they were the equivalent of the day. Their names were the Pharisees. A part of me is actually somewhat afraid to read about the Pharisees because I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want you to think that I think anybody here is a Pharisee. But at the same time, we all, myself included, have the potential of becoming such a person. We tend to think that because they crucified Christ, they are not at all alike us. In reality, the sect of the Pharisees, they are actually very much like us. Let's take a look at what they believed. They themselves were considered to be the conservatives of their day, whereas the Sadducees would be considered the liberals. They upheld the whole Bible. In their words, they upheld the whole Bible. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in the angels. They believed in the prophets. They believed in the coming of the Messiah. The Sadducees, on the other hand, only believed in the Torah. They rejected anything that was outside of the Torah. They did not believe in angels. They did not believe in the afterlife. They did not believe in a judgment. They did not believe that your actions would either take you to heaven or to hell. They rejected all of these forms and only held the Torah of Moses. There was another sect. They were called the Essenians. They were very much like our Amish. They held to themselves. They held to an old faith. They were very much. They believed a lot of the same things that the Pharisees believed, but they also believed that they should separate themselves from society. Then they also, all three differed in the fact that the Pharisees believed both in free will and in predestination. The Sadducees believed that only free will exists, and the Essenians only believed in predestination. In other words, they were kind of like Calvinists. Most Protestants, myself included, believe that free will and predestination are two sides of the same coin. That God knows everything. He knows the outcome. But at the same time, we have the freedom of choice in our own lives, which also determines what happens. So as you see, they believed, they at least they said that they believed the exact same things. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 23. Let's read what Jesus had to say about them. From verse 2, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. And take that to heart. Jesus is saying, our King is saying to us, everything that they say, do and observe. In other words, what they're preaching is right. But his problem with them is, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them, so much as a finger. They give rules and regulations that they themselves are not going to take upon themselves. They preach judgment, but they don't believe in a judgment in their own lives. They do all their deeds to be noticed by men. They broaden their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels of their garments. Today, I would probably explain that. Back in the 90s, I'd say they wear specific types of suits and specific ties that show that they are more like God. Nowadays, I'd say the opposite. They probably have dreads and tattoos and try to be the cool pastor to show that they are more like God and in tune with the youth, rather than just being themselves. In every culture and every day, there's a different type of way of doing it. If it's not phylacteries and tassels, it could even be tattoos and dreads, just to show off, just to say, I'm the hip pastor. They love the place of honor at banquets and chief seats in synagogues, and respectful greetings in marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is their teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, and that is the Christ. I don't believe that Jesus is actually saying don't call, like, specifically leader, because they had obviously leaders in the first church. And obviously you should call your parents dad and mom. What he's talking about is titles. And these titles, they shift in every generation. Nowadays, I'd say in the church, the title that we would say, do not be called prophet. It's a popular title in the church of today. I'm a prophet. Listen to what I have to say. Thus saith the Lord. If you are a prophet, your deeds will prove it. Your words will be made manifest. You don't need to trump your own horn. Do not call yourself, I'm an evangelist. Listen to what I have to say. Because if you are an evangelist, you'd be preaching. You don't have to have a title to be who God calls you to be. Sometimes people ask me, are you a pastor? To me, I'm not a pastor. If anything, I'm the sheepdog. I'm not even worthy of being a sheep. I'm the guy that barks. Sadly, the barking dog, they can actually be changed if I start biting my master. When they asked John the Baptist, who are you? Are you Elijah? He was Elijah, by the way. Jesus said he was Elijah. But he said, no, I'm not. I'm just a voice calling in the wilderness. Make way for the Lord. And Jesus was God of the universe. But he did not go around saying, I'm God, look at me. There were only several places in the Bible that could be interpreted as him saying, I am God. And that's by him saying, I am the I am. But it was obvious he was God. He was walking on water. He was flying through the air. They tried to kill him several times and they couldn't do it. The Pharisees knew who he was. It's a false statement to say that the Pharisees didn't know who Jesus was. They knew him. They just didn't like him. The Jews of his day were expecting him to come on a white horse with a flaming sword, but he came on a donkey. And his sword was the word of God. Sadly, nowadays the Jews are waiting for a Messiah to come on a donkey. But he's coming on a horse. And the church completely forgot about the king. Because, yes, we preach about the king a lot, but we don't preach about his second coming. Because, like I said last week, so many doomsday prophets have been saying it's happening in 2012, it's happening in 2016, it's happening here, and it's happening there. And everybody got dulled down to it, so they're at the point where I don't want to hear anymore about the apocalypse. But that is a mistake. You'll lose the plot of the book if you forget about the ending. We need to be looking towards the ending as the hope of his coming. Jesus came to a little girl from Nazareth, and all of Jerusalem were troubled by it. They heard from a group of pagans that the king of the Jews was here. That freaked them out. They finally had a certain sort of peace with Herod. Let's talk a moment, a little bit, about the history of this whole thing, how it all happened. Has anybody ever heard of Judah the Maccabee? Yeah? Judah the Maccabee was a hero, not unlike David or many other heroes of the Old Testament. You can read about him in the apocryphal book called the Maccabees. But Judah the Maccabee, Judah Maccabeus, he did make one big mistake at the end of his life, which has led Israel into ruin to this very day. He made a pact with the Romans just to finally have peace. And in this pact, he said, the enemies of Rome will be the enemies of Israel, and the enemies of Israel will be the enemies of Rome. You will come to our aid, and we'll come to your aid. We'll be buddies. Sadly, that pact did not save his life. He still died in battle. After he died, his brother, Jonathan, rose up. And Jonathan is known among many rabbis as the man of lies. The Maccabees, they were Levites. They were priests. But they were not sons of Aaron, which means they cannot be the high priest, according to the law of Moses. But Jonathan, he got rid of the Zadokian priests, the Aaronian priests, and set himself up as a priest, as the high priest. He dies, and after him, his brother Simon continues his brother's legacy. After Simon dies, his son, John Hyrcanus, he not only becomes high priest, he becomes king of the Jews. He names himself king of the Jews. Even though he is not a son of David and did not have that right, he was a Levite, not even a son of Aaron, and did not have a right to either positions. But he names himself king of the Jews and becomes a Sadducee, because the Pharisees, they were the conservatives. They said, you can't be king. You're not of David's line. Good for the Pharisees. You're right. He can't be king. And a civil war started up. John Hyrcanus then dies. His brother Aristobulus I continues his legacy. He dies. Alexander Janus becomes king, a tyrant and a priest. He dies. And then their wife, all three of them had the same wife, because by the law of Moses, if you die childless, then your wife will become your brother's wife. Their wife, Salome Alexandra, became the second queen of all of Israel in the entire history of Israel, the queen of Judea. She was herself a Pharisee, even though her husbands were Sadducees. And as a Pharisee, she calls the Pharisees back to the table. She goes, come on, guys, come on back here. We need your help. We'll set up the Sanhedrin. We'll make you guys, we'll give you a position in the kingdom. There's only one thing we need to do. We need to forget about David's house. Let it alone. Forget about the Messiah. Just forget about it. We need peace. We need Christians in the government. We need our own kingdom on earth. A free kingdom with freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We just need to keep this David scandal under wraps. And the Pharisees agree to it. And from that day on, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, nobody thought about the house of David. They completely forgot about it. It wasn't an important thing. It was more like a mythology. And all this time, the house of David, they went from being kings and they went into becoming carpenters and janitors. Nobodies. And Jesus was born among them. By the time that Jesus was born, the house of the Maccabees had already fallen. Herod the Great was now king, and Herod wasn't even a Jew. He was an Edomite. He married into the Maccabee family, murdered the Maccabee kings, married into their family, then murdered his wife, who was a Maccabee, then murdered his 2 sons, who were Maccabees, and then took a Gentile wife. And his other sons, who we later on hear about in the scripture, the other Herods, were complete Gentiles. Had no right at all to the kingdom. They weren't even Levites. They were nobodies. And yet they took the position of king. So when I name him an Antichrist, I don't mean the Antichrist. I mean one of many. Let's read it. Let's do a quick reading about the character of an Antichrist. Let's open up the book of Daniel, chapter 11. Daniel is a very good book if you want to read about the end times. Daniel 11. We'll be reading from verse 36. Then the king will do as he pleases. This is talking about the man of sin, the Antichrist, or an Antichrist. These are the character traits you can find in anybody who becomes a king in this world, and we need to be wary of. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things about the God of gods. Who's a god in our days? We don't believe in Zeus anymore. The gods of our days, I would say, are political leaders, people in Hollywood, sports figures. They're big names. He'll name himself above all the other names. He'll name himself the best, the greatest. Everybody else is less in comparison to him. At the peak of his power, he'll name himself greater than the God of gods. Not all antichrists get to that point. But they are always very pompous about who they are. And they let everybody know about it. He will prosper until the indignation is finished. His beginning of his reigns will always be prosperous. It will seem like a blessing had come to the land. He'll do the right sort of policies that we like, but it'll always have an ending that is very bad. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, nor the desires of women. This is another thing. He doesn't care about God. He doesn't care about the gods. He doesn't care about who his parents believed in. He believes in himself. He's known as having no desire for women. In other words, he disregards women. It could mean he's homosexual. It could mean he's misogynistic and known for that. It could mean he murdered his wife and known for that. All of these antichrists have that in common. They're known for being of no regard for women. And he will nor will he show any regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a God of fortresses. He'll honor his own structures, his buildings. his walls. He'll honor everything he builds with his hands. He will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know, a God who the former kings didn't care very much about, but he will care about that. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses who are against him. He'll take action against any kingdom that names itself greater than his own kingdom. And with his help of this foreign God, this structure, this building God, he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over many and will parcel out the land for a price. I'm not preaching against any particular president. I'm not preaching against voting for any particular president or even being happy with any particular president. But there are things we need to keep in mind, that we need to check ourselves as Christians. We need to watch, be wary of. Not saying start a rebellion. I'm not saying speaking out against anybody, but I am saying be wary, be watchful of anybody who names himself great, of anybody who says he's better than anybody else, and that my kingdom will beat the other ones. Be wary of these people. Be cautious. Because this is what was happening in the days of Jesus. A king arose who built the temple, who built the walls, who made Jerusalem a force to be reckoned with. He had all the ties. He had the strength of Rome in his backing. The conservatives were with him. The Pharisees were for him. And yet he murdered all the children of Bethlehem to kill the King of Kings. That is what we need to be wary of, be awakened toward. That is who Herod was. And that was the kingdom into which Jesus was born. But there's a happy note. The kingdom that will be coming, the promise of that kingdom that will be coming. We're going to read about that. Let's open our Bibles. Actually, you know what? No, we're not going to open the Bible. I've got a passage from one of my favorite books, the Screwtape Letters. Have you ever read this book? I would advise you to. It's an interesting book. It's actually, according to C.S. Lewis, it is a book about demons and how they try to tempt a man. First, they start by tempting this man with the base temptations that everybody faces, such as lust, such as adultery, such as greed. These base ones that everybody knows are bad things. And then after he becomes a Christian, he has to change his tactics. And his new tactic is pride, becoming a Pharisee, being built up. But luckily, the ending is very good. And we're going to read from a passage from that. And that is actually what I'm getting to. Chapter 31. And this is Screwtape is the leader of these demons, and he's writing to his nephew Wormwood, who is the demon who's supposed to tempt this particular person. And Wormwood had just lost this person. This person went to Christ. So his response to him is, my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pigsney, how mistakenly now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of my affection, which I address you, meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are like two peas. I will always desire you as a pitiful fool desired me. The difference is I'm stronger. And I think they will give you to me now, or at least a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes, as dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You've let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through the levels of the kingdom of noise. That's what he calls the kingdom of hell. Down to the very throne of Satan himself. It makes me mad to think about it. How well I know what happened that instant he was snatched from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes, wasn't there? He saw you for the first time. He recognized the part you had in him, and he knew that you didn't have it any longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony, what he felt at that moment, as if a scab had fallen from an old wound, as if he were emerging from a hideous shell-like tetter, as if shuffled off for good, an all defiled, wet, and clinging garment. By hell, it is misery enough to see them in their mortal days taking off dirtied, uncomfortable clothing and bathing in hot water, giving grunts of pleasure, stretching their eased limbs. In other words, Satan even hates it when you get clean in the physical realm, let alone in the spiritual. The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgiving, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false of hopes of life, sheer instantaneous liberation. He's talking about the death of this man, but I want to propose this is the coming of the King. In a minute, a blinking of the eye, instantaneous resurrection, freedom from this life. It's a hope of his coming. One moment it seems to be all our world. It seems like it's all ours. The scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink, the taste of high explosives on the lips and on the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account at all. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool. Did you mark how naturally, as if he had been born for it, the earth-born vermin entered into this new life? How all this doubts became in a twinkling of the eye, ridiculous. Imagine that. Every doubt you have of angels and of God in a twinkling of an eye are just nothing but ridiculousness, foolishness. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course, it always was like this. All the horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse, and then forcing you into a kind of a bottleneck till. At the very moment when you think you must be crushed, behold, you were out of the narrows, and you were suddenly well. The extrication hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out, and you felt well. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke up. You die, and then you're beyond death itself. How could I ever have doubted it? And as he saw you, he also saw them. And I know how that was. You reeled back, dizzied and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by the bombs that we sent. The degradation of it, this thing of earth and slime, could stand upright and conversate with spirits before whom you, a spirit, would only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and the strangeness of it would dash his joy, but that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes. He calls the angels the gods, just so you understand. Not the gods that we should worship, but as immortal beings of immense power. He had no faintest conception till the very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But then when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one of them had played. At many an hour in his life when he had supposed himself alone, so that now he could say to them, one by one, not who are you? Imagine this. You won't be saying to your angels, who are you? You'll be saying, it was you all the time. It was you that was with me in my hour of doubt. It was you that encouraged me, that built me up. And all that they were and said in this meeting woke memories, the dim consciousness of friends about him, which haunted his solitudes from infancy, and now at last is explained. The central music and every pure experience, which was always just evaded memory, is now at last recovered. Recognition made him free of their company, almost before his limbs and his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. The demon was left outside of all of this beauty. And he saw not only them, but he saw him who we do not name. Who we do name, Jesus. This animal, this thing begotten in a bed, could look upon him. What is blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to this human. It is clarity itself. And this light, it wears the form of a man of all things. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in the presence of self-abhorrence and utter knowledge of his sins. Yes, Wormwood, a clearer knowledge even than yours, on an analogy of your choking, paralyzing sensation which you encounter in the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he will still have to encounter, but he embraces those pains. He would not barter them for any earthly pleasure. All the delights of sense or heart or intellect which would once have tempted him, everything that would have tempted him in this life, even the delights of virtue itself, even the delights of being a Pharisee, of being prideful, even these great delights, now seem to him in comparison, but the nauseous attractions of a rattled harlot, of a rattled prostitute, the attractions of a rattled harlot would seem to a man who hears that his true beloved, whom he loved his entire life, whom he believed to be dead, is alive and now at his door. And that will end. That is the word I have for you. The temptation remains. We can all become Pharisees. We could all get so caught up in the politicization of this world. Get caught up in Rome. But imagine everything that the devil tempts you with. Every single one of them is like the voice of a rattled harlot in comparison to the voice of the person that you loved your entire life. Anybody who lost somebody would know what it means to hear the voice of someone they loved beyond the door, alive again. Imagine that. The stories are true. The angels are real. The devil's real also, but he's under our feet. He's nothing. His system is nothing. His kingdoms are nothing. All that remains is the King of Kings. The light that would burn him, but is cool clearance to us. And that, we're going to take the communion. Let's stand. Ask the elders to come forward and prepare the blood and the elements of communion, the blood and the wine.